question, and I'm really looking forward to hear your answer about that. Is why is it so interesting for you to study ownership?
That's that's an interesting question, and I've pondered it quite a while. I honestly don't know the answer to that, but let me throw a couple things at you, but whether they're really the central ones or not, I don't know. First of all, I feel that ownership is an inherent part of the human condition. We naturally feel my, mine, ours. As Ori's work testifies, it starts very early in life. As parents, we don't have to ask or teach our kids to say why. They just naturally do. And they naturally, like the word why, they naturally, without being taught, express mine, my ball, my bucket. So that's part of it for me. Another part of it for me is that it consumes our lives in terms of it's present in all the stages of the life cycle. So it just doesn't first manifest itself like Ori and Neely found out when we're 3 or 4 years old, but it exists there when we're teenagers, it exists there when we're adults, it exists there when we are grandparents, if we're so fortunate to be, not necessarily for the same objects, but it's this there always. So I think that's probably why it has been interesting for me, why I'm curious about it. Whenever I think about it, I also get dragged back to what started it all for me. And that was a very good friend. He's going to take over a closed business here in Duluth, Minnesota. And they were going to start operating as an ESOP. And he said to me, he says, John, he says, I understand finance, but I don't understand people. And he said, will you monitor the psychological climate of this place for the first couple of years of operation? And I looked at him and said, Scott, I don't know anything about employee ownership. And he says, I don't either. And you've got lots of time to learn. So he was simply because he was a good friend, I launched myself into this quite blindly. And I started by studying co-ops and ESOPs. And that was sort of the birth, that context was sort of the birth of my coming to recognize or sense that ESOPs weren't going to be magical in terms of making people more satisfied, more productive, more motivated, because unless people felt like they were owners of something, it wasn't going to work. And the only thing in an ESOP that made people feel something is they had a financial stake in the business. But they didn't have a voice. They didn't have access to the company records and information about the place. And so I remember writing that only if all three of those rights are there, are people going to feel and start acting like owners. And that's the behavior, but they have to have it in their head. And they didn't have it in their heads with just the financial stake in the business. And so I'm always taken back to when I think about why this is important to me, it all goes back to that employee ownership as a legal arrangement. So I don't know if that answers your question or not, but it's part of my answer. Then I'm going to say one more thing about it. It's an incredibly powerful state. This is a sad story, but it's one that I'm reminded of sometimes when I think about how powerful the psychological ownership is. There was a sad incident that happened, and it was either, I think, in Duluth or Superior, but a woman who was a nurse one morning said to her husband, she says, I'm going to work and I'm leaving you. She went to the hospital, worked all day, came out, and her husband was standing there with a gun, and he proceeded to kill her. And as he did, he said, if I can't have you, nobody else is going to. And so I realized it's really capable of propelling us to do some crazy things, not all positive, some very sad things that just kind of grips us. And we see that in young kids too. It's not just adults doing crazy things, but we can see it in a kid in the sandbox or with their teddy bear or what have you. It can really stir some incredible emotions and attitudes, strong attitudes, and sometimes very good behaviors and sometimes very not so good behaviors, dark side.
Yeah. Let me veer off the script here for a bit, because it reminds me of something that I was talking to Joanne about, and that's also this dark side. She also mentioned it, and we were talking about measurement issues. I think it's something that you've been talking to Joanne about also in the past. Do you think that the current ways we are measuring it, and the psychological side of ownership, that it is able to capture the breadth of the phenomenon, this kind of like the simple scales, right? Are they sufficient, or do we need to revise our scales so that they can get better at disentangling the more malicious and the more benign sides of the phenomenon?
That's a good question. I, along with 3 other people, just published a paper in the, I can't remember now which journal it is, but we actually measured brain activity. And people were shown pictures of their own company and shown pictures of another organization with which they weren't familiar at all. And when the picture of their company came up, the neurological activity in their brains really fired up. You could see it, measure it. And so that's another way of measuring it. And it really corresponded with the paper and pencil questionnaires that we are using. I don't know how you're going to ever get anybody to necessarily put on the recording devices that are necessary to get the neurological activities measured at all. But it's a way for us, I think, to test possibly how robust our existing measures are, so we can gain more confidence or have a clue as to whether or not we need to revise them somehow, some way, because we're not masking what the brain is doing. And when it lights up so powerfully, when they're shown pictures of things that they are naturally close to, or it's a natural part of their lives, I think that's the path we have to walk down more than we have so far.
All right.
It was in the Frontiers of Psychology in the organization behavior section.
All right. Okay, I'll double check that.
The lead author was a Chinese colleague. His last name is Wang.
All right. I'll find it.
Yeah. If not, let me know. I can send it to you.
So that actually brings me to my next question, and that is about what is the most interesting, surprising, or also fundamental finding for you in your own research, but also maybe in that of others? If you had to name some things or one thing, what would it be?
Well, I just got done reading, and I'm going to mispronounce her name, Bjorga Martinievik, who's at in Holland, and I think she's at UTech University, and she's been studying massive migrations of people who were abandoning their own country because of political uphill or famine. Conditions aren't safe or what have you, and they're running into a very strong resistance, as I've seen here in the States, particularly under when Trump was president, about people basically saying, "Not in my country," and they're using the adjective, the personal pronoun. And she attributes it to feeling a sense of psychological ownership for territory, in this particular case, the country that the people are trying to get into, because they perceive it as a more safe place or a more prosperous place, greater opportunities or what have you. And we see these mass movements going on around the world, as you are well aware of, I'm sure, whether it's in Asia or here in the Americas or in different parts of Eastern and Western Europe. So to me, her work has been very eye-opening for me, because I haven't played around with anything as important as that. And so that's the stuff that's really moved me of late. Some very fascinating work. My own work, I don't know. I mean, I'm proud of what I've done, but it's not as earth-shaking as what she's doing, I think, or they're doing.
But I guess you might have kind of like set the foundations on which you built.
Yeah.
Right. So in that sense, you could feel ownership for it a little bit if you wanted to, I guess.
Oh, well, I do. I just try to hide it a little bit.
That's actually relating to something. So it's so great to have all those interviews on a day, because it's relating to something that Ori mentioned earlier that he found quite interesting, because he hadn't been thinking about it that much. And that's kind of like, I think there's a new book out from two economists, two lawyers, law professors, Mine, How the Hidden Rules of Ownership Control Our Lives. I don't know whether you've come across that. I had not known that. Where he says that one of the things then there is that the principle of, they call it attachment, right? If you own something and that then hides something, leads to something else, then you are also seen as an owner of what comes out of it. So you own a piece of land and then there's gold found beneath it, and automatically you also become the owner of that gold. And I think that to some extent, one could potentially kind of like perpetrate that to intellectual knowledge. So where you built a foundation and out of this, it was possible to come to this new.
You know, one more thing that really surprised me a lot too, Bernadette, is I'm an organizational psychologist, and I'm interested in organizations. I'm interested in what organizations and their work conditions do to people. And it was out of that context in which the idea was hatched about psychological ownership. But I'm amazed and very elated to see how deep roots it's got in marketing now. And I never dreamed that that was going to happen. And it's the same thing with entrepreneurship and creativity and education and healthcare. It's really grabbed a hold of a lot of people in very, very diverse areas that are adding and enriching a lot of their literatures. And that's very pleasing to me. But I was also extremely surprised by it. I never dreamed that that's where it was going to go. It makes sense that it went there. Because obviously the sense of ownership as a psychological phenomenon doesn't just exist in young children and selfish adults. So that's another surprising thing.
Right.
So
yeah. It's big. It's very big.
So how did it grab you? How did it grab you?
Actually, it grabbed me before I knew of your work. I was calling it mental ownership for a long time. It was just kind of like a phenomenological observation that people call things mine that aren't theirs. Yeah, right. So when people go shopping and they see something they like, and then that was the key observation, right? And then they don't buy it, but they see another person later on with that object that they thought about getting, haven't gotten yet, and somebody else got it, and they say, hey, you got my bag or whatever, right? So they've never been an owner. It's sitting in the shop, but just the mere kind of like mental engagement with it made them feel like it's their bag, and if somebody else gets it, they feel like somebody's taken away something from them that they never had. So this phenomenon, and I called it mental ownership, and I was coming from a sunk cost direction. I thought, is there something like sunk benefits? We're kind of like engaged with something mentally. So it was coming really from the imagery direction. And it was rather late in the process that I realized that I came across your work. And from then on, I called it psychological ownership, and I had a much more theory to draw on than my own observations. And I mean, I had come across Falk's work, etc., but I hadn't known about your work by then. And so I still have some folders where I call it mental ownership rather than psych ownership, because that's how I came across it. So it started quite independently, and then I had the fortune of getting a richer body of evidence to draw on when coming across your work.
Good.
Yeah. I think one thing that has become clear already out of that conversation is that it's super big, right? And so that leads to my next question, and that's, where do you see a potential or actual role of ownership and all of the related phenomena when it comes to the big societal issues? Pick whichever you want, and you've got to be selective, I guess, because there's so much one could say potentially.
Yeah. Well, and part of answered that with the comment about mass migrations and that work. But I also see it right now. I hate to bring politics into the issue, but I'm going to. Not too far from you in the world, there is a leader of a big nation who feels as though he is losing power and influence over people in another country. And if it was, my memory is correctly, it was yesterday, he used one of those personal pronouns in front of the name of that country.
Right.
My Ukraine.
Seriously? Okay, I had not heard that.
Yeah, my Ukraine.
Right.
And so besides the massive migration, that's clearly one place where I'm seeing it almost on the daily news here in the States about what's going on and why is it going on and how far is it going to go and so on and so forth. But they were making a big deal out of his comment yesterday about putting that word "my" in front of the word Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
So those are the two places that have really come to my mind in response to your question raised. Right. I'm sure there are lots of other places.
Yeah.
Obviously, our ex-president feels as though everything is his. Even the government papers that he's supposed to have turned over to the archives, he's ripping up and throwing them away, and so it's he feels he has a right to do that because they're his.
Right.
So yeah.
Yeah. It already actually coming to the last question, and that's, what's yours? what's your most valuable possession, so to speak? And now define valuable and possession as broadly and freely as you want.
I smiled when I saw that question. And the reason that I smiled when I saw that question is because in my teaching, I've spent some time talking about psychological ownership. And one of my students had me often enough through the 4 years of his being a student that he knew my son's name. He didn't know my son, but he had heard me refer to my son, Eric. And he asked me a question. He said, "What do you prize the most in terms of what you possess?" And I thought about it for a minute, and unlike Ori, who I agree, don't like to think about my family as mine, but so my mind went, in response to that question, it went to things that I own, that I possess. And the one thing that really was important to me at one point in time, and it probably still is my number one sage fly rod. And I love to fish. It's a number 5. That's the weight of the rod, and it's a sage is the manufacturer fly rod. And I use it when I go bass fishing, and I use it when I go trout fishing. My son and I took a trip to the Rainy Lake, which is in northern Minnesota on the Canadian border. And my son picked up the rod and asked me if he could use it. And I said, no, you can't. If it got broken, I would feel devastated. I said, if you want a number 5 sage rod, I will buy you one, but you cannot use mine, because I didn't want it broken. And I really have got this intimate relationship with that fly rod because I've learned it. It talks to me. And it's that answer to your question. It's not family photos. And I sympathize when Ori mentioned that, but it was that physical object.
Right.
Yeah. And I actually said no to my son. He couldn't use it. Didn't make me feel good, but I did it.
Yeah. Oh, that's great.
So I've been asked that question on a couple of occasions. He never said that he wanted me. He never said he wanted me to buy him one. So I think it was kind of a spur of the moment thing for him too. But anyhow.
Probably would always be the second best, right?
But that does remind me of the fact that possessions can lead to very negative consequences for the individual if they're lost. The loss of a child, the loss of a home, loss of one's life savings, as well as a stupid fly rod, or one that could be very easily replaced with a few $100s.
Right.
So anyhow, yes, it doesn't necessarily make me feel good to know that I said no to him, but I did. Anyhow.
Yeah, it quite often tells us something about ourselves, right?
Yeah.
Learning about what we treasure, and when we just feel that it's wrong for somebody else to use something. That's quite informative.
I have often wondered to what extent, and these are not quite the right words, to what extent is psychological ownership real versus is it a masking of wanting to keep others from laying a claim to it.
Right.
And it's kind of like a wall that we want to put up to prevent their access to it. And that's just one way of constructing that wall, is to say, no, it's mine.
Yeah.
Whether we really feel it that way or not.
Yeah.
And I haven't worked through that, but that does occasionally come to my mind.
I think there's quite a lot in this.
Whether there's something false in it.
Yeah. Yeah. And that leads me back to the question of whether the instruments we're using are sufficient to capture the whole essence also of the phenomenon, right?
Because I think with young children, once again, you don't know for sure what's going on in their minds, but when they say mine and take that bucket or ball away from their friend, is it really because their friend is grabbing it and playing with it? Or is it simply that you don't want them to have it? And then you can ignore it after you've got it back. And so I don't know. Under what kind of conditions that exists or doesn't exist.
And I think kind of like it relates back to something I talked about with Ori, and that's, this kind of like individual experience that's characterizing the relationship between the ownership target and yourself. This is kind of like the one thing. And then there's the whole phenomenon of ownership attributions that Ori has been studying a lot also, kind of like, it's kind of not so much about to which extent do you feel personally kind of like entangled and close to the object, but also about to which extent do you think it's yours rather than somebody else's. And that's an interesting aspect, I think, that where those two literatures haven't been really merged yet.
Yes, they haven't.
But they are close to each other, and they might, I think if we bring them together, maybe we are better able to kind of like distinguish between the benign and the malicious consequences, dark side and the sunny side of it.
I am amazed, and of course I'm I haven't done it either, but I'm amazed that there are so many yet unanswered questions.
Mm.
Like, who is the psychological ownership? How does the demise of a sense of ownership that previously existed cease to exist?
Yeah.
What role does time play in both the development of psychological ownership, and what role does it play in its demise?
Mm.
So there are a lot of I find interesting questions that I have yet to pursue, and I'm surprised that they haven't been pursued more in the literature.
Yeah.
There have been very few tests of the whole theory, with all its moderators and mediators in it. And that's also has surprised me. And I too have not picked up that ball and run very far with it, but I don't know for sure why.
Right. I actually have a couple of things in the file drawer that might be doing some of those tests, but you see, one of the issues we are having quite often is that tests of existing theory are not appreciated too much in the top journals. They want to have a new theoretical contribution, which I think sometimes hampers
Yes, I think it does
theoretical
too.
developments. And so
I agree.
I've got a lot of things in my file drawer that
Yeah.
could be quite, and many others too, for sure. But
that's really true.
So we'll see.
The Academy of Management journals, the review and the journal, particularly the journal where you publish the empirical pieces, they basically have got a policy that says you have to have major theory work up front. Well, that doesn't allow much digging into the theory.
Into what's
there already. It just encourages developing more theories.
Yeah.
So.
So we've got a universe of phenomena that might all be connected, but nobody dares to spell it out because that would undermine their own contribution.
Yeah, that's true.
That's true. Is there anything else you'd like to share on the notion of ownership on the whole phenomena and something?
I don't think so right now. There will be after we're all done having this conversation, I'm sure. That always happens. But right now I can't think of anything else. I really enjoyed your questions. I enjoyed thinking about your questions.
Glad to hear that. And I really enjoy listening to your answers. It's a thought-provoking day for me, actually.
Oh, I bet it has been.
It's very nice, and it's like my first mini conference, my very own one since COVID has started. So a privilege. Yeah,
that has gotten in the way of lots of aspects of our lives, hasn't it?
It has, and it has taught us a lot about the human condition, right? So
yep, it is. So
among others. So maybe one thing I'd like to ask you about, it's something that has come up in my conversation with Joanne, and that's, you've been adding the stimulation principle rather late as a kind of like as a predictor, as an antecedent of psychological ownership. How has that come about, and how strong do you see it in comparison to the others?
I missed the first part of what you said.
So the stimulation, you've added stimulation to the theory rather late. Can you say something about that? And that's kind of like what has triggered that? And do you see it really on equal footing with the three earlier forces? That's something I've been wondering about as well. And Joanne has been wondering about it too, because, it's kind of like, it's a little bit more like an individual difference characteristic. Also, it can vary situationally. Compared to the other forces. So what triggered it?
Well, this goes back to my story about the origins of it all. And the origin was that there's a bundle of rights that we tend to possess as legal owners of things. And that in that bundle, if you and I owned a cabin together, 50-50. You've got a financial stake in it. So do I. You've got a right to know how I'm using it, when I'm using it, what I used it for, and I have that same right. And you have a right to control to a certain degree how that cabin is used and when it's used. And so do I. So there's a financial stake, there's an informational stake, and there's a control or influence stake. So those three rights that accompany legal ownership were the things that were missing when an ESOP arrangement was put in place. The only right that the employee was getting was a financial stake, but no voice and no access to the information. And that's when I said, though they all those employees own a house or a car, they now have ownership in the company, but they're very different from one another in the sense that they can control and influence and have a financial stake in the car, but in the company, they don't. So that's where the control part came into the picture. And that's where the intimate knowing part that came into the picture that was missing under legal ownership as opposed to psychological ownership. So that's how those three antecedents, if you will, became a part of the model.
Right.
And once again, the birth was within the work and organization context, not any other context. And so that's where it came from. Now, if you look at in a legal dictionary, if you look at the issue of ownership, it's very common that you'll see that legal ownership is a bundle of rights, three of which I just mentioned that are inherent in the legal system. They're protected, but they're defined by the law and they're protected by the law. So it's a really inherent part of legal ownership. And so I was advocating in my application part of that article, that was that 1991 piece, I advocate that if you want to create ownership in an organization for your employees, you've got to give them a voice. You've got to give them the opportunity to exercise some influence, not just so many shares of the stock in the company that they only have access to basically at the end of their career in that company. So it's not even quite the same thing of having the money in your pocket as opposed to a promise that you will eventually get it.
Yeah.
So that's where those three things came from. And it just kind of stuck and hung on to the theory as it evolved beyond the business context into a number of other disciplines. I think that's the answer, my answer to your question.
I mean,
or
what I was referring to was,
or did I miss the
stimulation. You brought up stimulation at a later stage.
Yeah, no, I actually brought it up very early on the stage and I was discouraged from putting it in. So do you understand why?
Well, I guess it is at a very different.
We do things with our things that we possess, and that's the stimulation.
Right.
Whether it's rearranging the house or painting it.
Right.
It's got an activity component that's associated there.
Right. Yeah.
I walk into a motel room for the night or for 2 days. What do I do first? Open up the closet, hang up a jacket or shirt, put some stuff in a drawer or two, just trying to make it a little bit more me, as opposed to a cold environment in which I've just walked into. And that's, why am I doing that? Other than, maybe the comfort of doing it, but also it's stimulation. So that's where it came from, is those kinds of thoughts, I think. I've never done anything with the stimulation part other than talk about it.
Joanne did, actually.
Yeah. Yes, she has. Yeah. So.
Yeah. All right. Thanks a lot, Jon. It's been super
It was nice
informative
to see.
and enjoyable to talk to you.